There's an old saying that fits this moment perfectly. When you try to close every door, don't be surprised when the world learns how to walk away without you. That's the irony unfolding right now between Mexico and the United States. And almost nobody in the mainstream media is explaining it with the seriousness it deserves. For years, Donald Trump treated visas like a weapon, not a diplomatic tool, not an administrative process, a weapon. Mexican travelers were forced to wait months, sometimes more than a year, for appointments that should have taken weeks. Families were denied entry for minor technicalities that wouldn't have raised an eyebrow a decade earlier. Business professionals with decades of clean travel history were questioned, fingerprinted and treated as if they were criminals simply for wanting to attend a conference or visit relatives. People were humiliated. Grandmothers traveling to see grandchildren born in Texas. Students accepted to American universities. Entrepreneurs building companies that employed Americans. All of them forced to prove they deserve permission to cross a border that their ancestors crossed freely for centuries. Visas became punishment. Borders became leverage. And the assumption in Washington was simple. Mexico would always need the United States more than the United States needed Mexico. That assumption shaped policy. It shaped rhetoric. It shaped the arrogance with which American officials treated their southern neighbor. That assumption is now collapsing in real time, because in 2026, Mexico didn't respond with retaliation. It didn't demand visas from Americans. It didn't mirror Trump's hostility with equivalent hostility. It didn't descend into the pettiness that characterizes so much of modern international relations. Instead, it did something far more powerful. Mexico stopped needing approval. It stopped depending on a single market. It stopped waiting for permission to prosper. And if you're not paying attention to what's happening with Mexican tourism, trade, and global connectivity right now, you're missing one of the most important geopolitical shifts in the U.S.-Mexico relationship in decades. The transformation is structural, it's measurable, and it's accelerating faster than anyone in Washington anticipated. Since returning to power, Trump has revoked visas on a massive scale. The numbers are staggering when you actually examine them. More than 100,000 visas canned in coordinated sweeps. Immigrant visa processing suspended for citizens of 75 countries in a single month. Latin America hit hard. Mexico hit harder than almost anyone else. According to Reuters, more than 50 Mexican politicians and officials had their visas revoked. Not criminals, not cartel members. Elected officials, governors, mayors, legislators, senior public servants who had traveled to the United States for years without incident. The governor of Baja California publicly confirmed that both her visa and her husband's visa were revoked without explanation. The mayor of Nogales, a border city whose economy depends on cross-border cooperation, lost his visa. Former U.S. Ambassador Earl Anthony Wayne openly acknowledged what was happening. The Trump administration was finding new ways to apply pressure on Mexico. This wasn't immigration enforcement. This was collective punishment disguised as policy. The message was clear. Cooperate on our terms or face consequences. Accept humiliation or lose access. Submit to pressure or watch your leaders stripped of the ability to engage with their most important neighbor. But while Washington was tightening its grip, something unexpected happened. Something that should have been impossible, according to the logic that guided American policy. Mexico's tourism sector exploded, not slowly, not marginally, not as a temporary rebound from pandemic lows, explosively, structurally, historically. In 2025 alone, Mexico welcomed over 79 million international visitors. That's the highest number in the country's entire history. Not the highest since the pandemic, the highest ever recorded. A year-over-year increase of more than 13% at a time when global tourism growth averaged far less. Tourism revenue surpassed 28 billion direct revenue. That doesn't count the multiplier effects, the jobs created in adjacent industries, the taxes collected, the infrastructure built to accommodate growth. The sector now contributes nearly 9% of Mexico's entire GDP. Global travel organizations project that figure could rise to 15% within the decade, supporting roughly 8 million jobs directly and millions more indirectly. Let those numbers settle for a moment. 8 million jobs in one sector, built not on oil, not on manufacturing, not on remittances, but on Mexico's ability to attract the world. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't luck. This wasn't the natural result of having beaches and ruins and good weather. This was strategy. Mexico learned a lesson the hard way over the past decade. When you depend on a single customer, that customer controls you. For decades, U.S. tourists dominated Mexican tourism. It was easy, familiar, and profitable. Americans could drive across the border. Flights were cheap and plentiful. The cultural connection was deep. Cancún, Puerto Vallarta, Cabo San Lucas became extensions of American vacation culture. But that convenience came with vulnerability. One hostile administration, one change in policy, one border restriction, one president who decided to weaponize the relationship, and the entire system could be shaken. Trump understood that vulnerability. He exploited it. He used visas as punishment. He used tariffs as threats. He used rhetoric as humiliation. He gambled that Mexico had no choice but to absorb whatever he delivered. So Mexico adapted. It had no choice. Survival demanded diversification. Under President Claudia Sheinbaum, the government launched an aggressive, systematic diversification strategy that touched every aspect of the tourism sector. Today, the United States still accounts for a large share of visitors. That won't change overnight. Geography is permanent. But Mexico is actively, deliberately, strategically reducing that dependency month by month. The tourism ministry announced targeted campaigns across Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Not vague aspirations, specific initiatives with budgets, metrics, and timelines. Spain, France, Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom. Each market received customized outreach, cultural partnerships, airline agreements, influencer campaigns, trade missions, and the results were immediate. European tourism surged. Italian tourism alone grew nearly 15% in a single year. French arrivals increased. German tourism expanded. British visitors seeking alternatives to increasingly expensive Mediterranean destinations discovered that Mexico offered comparable experiences at competitive prices, with none of the visa complications that plagued travel to other long-haul destinations. But Europe was only part of the strategy. Asia represented the real frontier. The Mexican government opened direct air routes to China, South Korea, Japan, and India. These weren't symbolic gestures. These were calculated investments in connectivity that would have seemed impractical a decade ago. China entered the top 10 source markets for Mexican tourism. South Korea followed. Panama, serving as a hub for Latin American connectivity, became a crucial transit point. The numbers tell a story that no political rhetoric can obscure. Mexico isn't waiting for American permission anymore. It's building alternatives. And those alternatives are working. Air connectivity tells the same story with even greater clarity. In just 1 year, Mexico added over 100 new flight routes, tens of thousands of additional flights scheduled, millions of additional seats. Airlines that had never operated in Mexico announced service. Airlines that had reduced Mexican routes reversed course and expanded. Mexico isn't just connected to the United States anymore. It's connected to the world. Direct flights to Madrid, Paris, London, Frankfurt, Amsterdam. Direct flights to Tokyo, Seoul, Shanghai. Connections through Panama, Bogotá, São Paulo that open entire continents. Every new route is a statement. Every additional seat is a vote of confidence. Every passenger who chooses Mexico over alternatives represents a market that doesn't depend on American goodwill. This week, Mexico was the guest of honor at FIR 2026 in Madrid. For those unfamiliar, FITUR is the most important tourism fair on the planet. The annual gathering where countries compete for attention, where deals are signed, where the future of global travel is shaped. Being named guest of honor isn't ceremonial. It's recognition of significance. It's an invitation to showcase what you offer to the entire world. Mexico sent an unprecedented delegation. All 32 states represented. Hundreds of companies, tourism boards, hotel chains, airlines, cultural organizations. The message was unmistakable. Mexico is open for business, and that business extends far beyond the northern border. The timing was intentional. 2026 is the World Cup year. Mexico will host matches in Mexico City, Monterrey, and Guadalajara. The tournament will bring global attention that money cannot buy. An estimated 5.5 million additional visitors are expected. Tourism spending projected to jump nearly 50% compared to baseline years. Infrastructure investments accelerating to accommodate the surge. This is Mexico's moment on the world stage, and it arrives precisely when Trump's policies have made the contrast between openness and closure impossible to ignore. And here's where the irony becomes impossible to ignore, where the absurdity of American policy collides with the reality of American behavior. Millions of Americans, including many who supported Trump's policies, including many who cheered his rhetoric about invasions and criminals and walls, will travel to Mexico for the World Cup. They will cross the same border Trump called an invasion route. They will spend their dollars in the country he threatened with tariffs and military action. They will rely on Mexican hospitality, Mexican infrastructure, Mexican organization. They will eat in Mexican restaurants, sleep in Mexican hotels, be protected by Mexican police, be served by Mexican workers, earning wages that support Mexican families. And Mexico will welcome them without visas, without humiliating interviews, without months of waiting for appointments, without demands for financial bonds, without suspicion, without the treatment that Mexican travelers endure when they try to visit the United States. Because Mexico understands something Trump never did, something his entire worldview cannot accommodate. Tourism is prosperity, not punishment. Openness is strength, not weakness. Hospitality is strategy, not surrender. While Trump turned the U.S. visa process into a nightmare, Mexico opened doors wider than ever. The contrast deserves examination. U.S. visa appointments now take months, sometimes a year or more. Interviews mandatory for everyone, including toddlers and seniors. Applications denied arbitrarily, with no explanation and no recourse. financial bonds demanded from travelers with perfect histories, entire families rejected because one member once overstayed by a week 2 decades ago. Meanwhile, Mexican passport holders enjoy visa-free access to over 150 countries. The Schengen zone of Europe, wide open, the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, much of Asia expanding access rather than restricting it. Mexican tourists can explore Paris, Rome, Tokyo, London without asking permission. American policy ensures that Mexican visitors face interrogation to visit Orlando, and the money followed openness. That's the part that should concern American policymakers, but apparently doesn't. Over 11 million Americans visited Mexico in a single year. 11 million. They spent billions, not millions, billions. That money stayed in Mexico. It created jobs in Cancun and Puerto Vallarta and Mexico City and Oaxaca. It paid wages that supported families. It built hotels and restaurants and experiences. It funded infrastructure. It generated taxes that funded public services. What did the United States gain from restricting Mexican visitors? Lost talent that went to Canada or Europe instead? Lost families who stopped trying to reunite? Lost business travelers who found other markets? Lost students who studied elsewhere? Lost goodwill that took generations to build and months to destroy? The trade-off isn't even close. The cruelty wasn't even strategic. It was spite dressed as policy. President Sheinbaum's ambition goes further than managing the current moment. She's building for a future where Mexico's position is unassailable. Mexico aims to become the 5th most visited country in the world by 2030. Not 5th in Latin America, 5th globally. Ahead of nations that have centuries of tourism infrastructure, ahead of countries that Americans think of as naturally dominant. The plan involves massive infrastructure investment, airports expanded, highways constructed, cultural tourism developed in regions that have been overlooked for decades, ecotourism in jungles and forests and coastlines that remain pristine. Medical tourism attracting patients from around the world who can receive quality care at a fraction of American prices. Gastronomy elevated to match the recognition Mexican cuisine already enjoys. The Maya train connects communities and heritage sites across the Yucatan Peninsula. Passenger numbers have soared beyond projections. Tourists who once stayed in resort enclaves now travel through regions they never would have seen, spending money in communities that never benefited from tourism before. Even Acapulco, devastated by Hurricane Otis in 2023, a storm that seemed apocalyptic in its destruction, has recovered over 90% of its hotel capacity. That recovery didn't happen through American aid. It happened through Mexican resilience, Mexican investment, Mexican determination. And this isn't just about tourism. It's about dignity. That word matters. Dignity. It's easy to overlook in discussions of economics and geopolitics. It's easy to focus on trade balances and visitor numbers and investment flows. But dignity is what changed in Mexico. Dignity is what Trump's policies inadvertently strengthened. When Trump threatened tariffs, Mexico diversified its trade relationships. When Trump threatened military intervention, Mexico reinforced sovereignty and drew red lines. When Trump revoked visas for elected officials, Mexico built tourism records. When Trump closed doors, Mexico built bridges to every continent. Each threat met with quiet competence. Each insult absorbed with public composure. Each attempt at humiliation answered not with reciprocal humiliation, but with results. The result is a country no longer reacting in fear, but acting with confidence. Mexico no longer waits for permission to grow. It no longer depends on goodwill from Washington. It no longer flinches at threats designed to produce flinching. And that more than any specific policy or statistic is what unsettles Trump. His entire approach depends on fear-producing compliance. When fear disappears, the approach collapses. History shows this pattern repeatedly. When threats stop working, power shifts, not dramatically, not with announcements, quietly, structurally, irreversibly. Mexico reached that moment. It passed it without fanfare. A nation that was once spoken about as subordinate, as dependent, as a problem to be managed, now stands as indispensable. Not because it demanded recognition, because it earned it. The relationship has changed permanently, not through confrontation, but through competence, not through retaliation, but through resilience, not through matching hostility with hostility, but through building alternatives that made hostility irrelevant. Trump wanted Mexico to kneel. He said so in effect through every visa revoked, every tariff threatened, every insult delivered. Mexico stood up instead. And in doing so, it taught a lesson far bigger than visas or tourism or trade. Numbers. When dignity replaces fear, leverage disappears. When independence replaces dependence, threats lose their meaning. When a country stops needing approval, it becomes impossible to coerce. The rest of Latin America is watching. Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, Chile. They've all experienced American pressure. They've all been told how to structure their economies, and who to elect, and which policies to adopt. And they're all taking notes on Mexico's example. If Mexico can resist, if Mexico can grow while being threatened, if Mexico can diversify while being punished, then the template exists for others. The playbook is written. The proof of concept is complete. That's the deeper significance of what's happening. Not just one bilateral relationship recalibrating. An entire region learning what's possible when fear no longer dictates decisions. This is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where Mexico writes its own future rather than waiting for Washington to write it for them. A chapter where proximity to the United States is an advantage to leverage, not a vulnerability to endure. And if you blink, you'll miss how quickly the world moves on from those who only know how to close doors.